First, I'd like to welcome all of you to San Francisco State's Journalism Department Speaker Series here in the College of Arts and Humanities. A special welcome goes out to our professional colleagues from the Online News Association and the Society of Professional Journalists. We feel very lucky that you're joining us tonight as we hear from our special guest, Richard Gingras, who has returned to Google as the head of news products. For nearly 30 years, Gingras has led highly regarded efforts in the development of online services, software, and news media. These endeavors range from pioneering uses of satellite networking for TV, the first applications of television signals for data distribution, pre-web and web-based online services, and the creation of various platform technologies. Over the last several years, Gingras has focused his attention on the transformation of the news business. Indeed, he calls it a period of extraordinary and revolutionary change. In a recent speech at the University of Santa Clara, Gingras told his audience, "I'm not a journalist. And don't get me wrong, not that I would be proud to accept that label, but I haven't earned my stripes." Later in the same speech, Gingras defined himself as a technologist, spending more than 3 decades in the field of new media. More about this to come later. We're really excited about what Gingras is going to say tonight. Just a couple of other things. He was CEO of Salon Media Group, that was operates salon.com, the blogging community opensalon.com, and the pioneering virtual community, The Well. He was also co-founder, CEO, and chairman of Good Mall Systems. It's got a very long list, and I had to abbreviate it. So he also served as interim president of My Publisher. In that role, he guided the design of the popular custom hardcover photo book product introduced and branded by Apple as part of iPhoto. Gingras also explored the intersection of public policy, online commerce, and parody with the creation of Total Information Awareness Gift Shop, a satirical poke at government efforts to secretly mine data from vast arrays of corporate and governmental databases. A nonprofit, Gingras serves on the board of World Computer Exchange, which diverts used computers from landfills in the United States to educational facilities in developing countries. He also has worked toward the development of educational and public policy programs with departments of San Francisco State, UC Berkeley, and Stanford. Gingras began his career in television, holding various positions with PBS, KCET Los Angeles, and NBC during the 70s. He is a 1973 graduate of Boston College. Welcome, Richard.
I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. I particularly appreciate the opportunity to talk to journalism students. As some of you know who've heard me talk about these things before, yes, we're in a period of tremendous disruption. In fact, to some extent, I shouldn't say period of disruption because it's not clear to me when and if it will end. More about that later. But bottom line, I am one who feels tremendously optimistic about the future of journalism. I do believe that the future of journalism will be better than its past, and you could make arguments that we've already made tremendous progress in that regard. But the truth is how effective we are at attaining that objective of making a richer and more knowledgeable journalism ecosystem is in truth going to be defined by the people in this room. You're the ones who are going to create the new models, the new techniques, explore new paths, whether that's in the kinds of products that you create or how you advance the narrative form. It's all over the place. And we'll talk about, I'll try to touch on many of these things tonight. What I really like to try to do in these talks, if I can, and I've abbreviated some of the elements tonight, but feel free to jump in anytime along the way with questions, is as much as possible give you a sense, at least my personal view, of the evolving architecture of the news ecosystem, and really touch on every dimension of it, from how we find our audiences to how we architect our products in a very literal sense. to what are the underlying business models prior and future. Just as much as possible to give folks a sense of how things seem to be evolving. Like I said, these are my observations. There's nothing I'm going to say here that is absolutely proven to be true. We'll see how things play out. But we've had a fair period to look at the changes. Right, this period of disruption has been in play now for almost a decade, so I think we're having an increasingly good sense as to how these things are going to play out. I really want to, as much as possible, focus on the future and not the past. Clearly, again, disruption means that in any period of disruption, old players are the ones that get disrupted, and that's very painful. And we know that's very painful for the traditional news industry and newspapers in specific. But that being said, it's important that we really focus on where we're going, and I'm going to try to, at least with my remarks and comments and observations, focus more on the future than on the past. But I'm open to discuss any and all of that as we go forward. One of the things in that regard I want to touch on, as I said, the future of journalism really lies in the heads of the young folks in this room. You're the ones who are going to mold it, not me. I'll have maybe a touch more impact as I finish out my career. You guys will be the really ones driving that. In doing that, the whole notion of entrepreneurship is really important. And I'd like to touch on that for a second. In fact, I gave a talk recently, which maybe some of you saw, and if so, I apologize because I'm going to repeat some things tonight, to a Scripps Howard conference for journalism educators on how to stimulate entrepreneurship in journalism, which I think is a very, very important thing to do. But what I want to do is add an additional twist on that. One typically thinks of entrepreneurship as about starting businesses, and yes, that's true. I wouldn't suggest otherwise. But I want to broaden that definition to extend to you, the individual, the entrepreneurship of me, as it were. Because I think that is increasingly important in the kinds of times that we're in. Long are past are the days where you're going to join a company and be with that company for 20, 30, 40 years. Not likely the case. And so it's important that you get your mind around that and get your thinking around that in terms of how you evolve your own careers. And again, think about yourselves as that personal brand, as it were, that you're looking to evolve. In that regard, back to my past, yeah, I've done a lot of stuff. I've been around a long time. I've had tremendous opportunities and tremendous good fortune to have those opportunities. I cannot say that enough. I'm the luckiest guy in the world. I've got a tremendously fun job at Google, and I'll touch on that in a second. But the truth is, someone introduced me several years ago, and they went through that same long litany, and they ended it by saying, so, great to have Richard, because clearly he knows all the answers. And I went, well, no, not really. I don't know all the answers. I don't know them at all. I mean, if anything, what is true, if you've been doing the things I've done for as long as I've done them, is that you simply might have a little bit better sense as to what the right questions are to ask, meaning what questions you don't know the answers to. And that you've also had the opportunity to make far more mistakes than anyone else, which is a very important point. Because there is no such thing as entrepreneurship without making mistakes. And again, from the perspective of building a business or from the perspective of building your own personal brand. What I really want to convey to you here, particularly you as students, is to go out and take risks. Try things, do things, be creative in every part of your being. Take every opportunity to learn a new skill, take every opportunity to express that skill. And please don't be afraid about being wrong. Don't be afraid about not being perfect. Doesn't matter, right? You just want to get out there and express and learn from that. Two observations in that regard. When I started my first business, which failed, I wasn't able to even raise the money for it. I just did not know how to do it. But I remember a mentor of mine at the time who was advising me, and he said to me, Richard, he says, look, you may not succeed with this business, but you will succeed personally. If you simply make the kind of dedicated effort I know you're capable of, it doesn't matter how that business will end up, that you will come out of it with experience and knowledge and even a sense of confidence that you did not have before. And he was absolutely correct. and it was a lesson that stayed with me. So to just keep that in mind for yourselves. And another one, I'll quote someone who worked for me ages ago at Apple, a fellow by the name of Reid Hoffman, who went on and founded LinkedIn and has become immensely wealthy with his efforts in the tech space, and a very decent and good guy. But he said recently, he said to a bunch of entrepreneurs, and again, extend this to that full definition that I mentioned earlier, he said, look, if you're not embarrassed by the site when you launch it on day one, then you've waited too long to launch it. And his point was, get it out there. You can think about this stuff in your heads all day long. You can assess it for perfection all day long. And depending on what kind of head you have, that might just hold you back forever. You say, oh, it's not right, I don't feel it's right, I don't want to show it to anybody. Try to put that away. Try to put that away, because his point was, it'll only get better, it'll only get even close to perfect to the extent that you get the feedback from others, right? And that is so true. It is particularly true in this space where things are changing constantly. So please, as you go forward, keep that in mind. Take risks, make mistakes, recognize that if with each mistake, you'll learn from it, and you'll be a stronger person for it, you'll be a more knowledgeable person for it. So it's not about making mistakes, it's just simply about whether you have the increasing wisdom over time to recognize the mistakes when they occur and do your best to fix them and learn from them. That's all, enough said, right? Let's also talk about innovation in that regard. As I said earlier, there's this sense that we're in a period of disruption, and that somehow we're going to come out the other end and everything's going to be kind of smooth and copacetic for a long while. Not likely to be the case. In fact, when I was giving one of those talks earlier, I was sitting next to the dean of a major journalism school, and we were having that discussion, and I said, I tend to think people feel like we're in this transition from one steady state of the old news industry to some new steady state of the new news industry, and I think that's wrong. It's not. We're not in a simple transition. We're in a period of disruption that's going to continue, not just in its disruptive abilities, but the fact that the underlying technology is going to continue to change, continue to change, continue to change. We weren't thinking about the social layer 5 years ago. That's all we talk about now. What are we going to be talking about 3 years from now, or 2 years from now, or 5 years from now? It's going to be something else, which means you not only have to get comfortable with that change, you have to really rethink the whole approach to innovation. I did this slide, frankly, first thinking about organizational innovation, but it's truly true across the board. And one of the things that I hate is when I see, the notion that somehow innovation is done over here by the chief innovation officer in that little ideas lab that some companies create. And I think that's nonsense. True nonsense, because that's not the approach to building a successful organization in these kinds of fast-changing times. You really want to build innovation into the DNA of the company. You want to build innovation into every part of your thought process and every dimension of the arena that you're pursuing, whether it be news or whether it be, I don't care, making cars. And one of the things, if you just sort of look at some of the successful companies today, to back that up, we tend to think of Apple, for instance, or Google. Let's talk about Apple. We tend to think of Apple's innovation as in product design. And there's no question, it's deeply innovative in product design. But the only way that it's truly been able to be innovative in product design is to be innovative in every other part of that business. Right? They've been innovative in materials development. They've been innovative in how do you take a piece of aluminum and mold it and cut it into something that can be a unibody case for the new MacBooks. Right? So they're innovative in use of materials, innovation in machine processing, innovation in assembly, their innovation in what the out-of-box experience is. So talk about thinking outside the box. They're thinking innovation with the box itself. And so when I, again, for students, I'm saying, just make sure when you think about innovation that you look at every dimension of the problem that you're looking to solve. But anyone here who's working in existing organizations, it's so important to get innovation into every part of the organization. There's no part of the organization where innovation cannot happen to the benefit of the overall effort of that innovation, of that company. So I want to keep that, I think it's important to keep that in mind. The advance of technology, I remember several years ago, I was asked to give a talk at Berkeley, and someone said, would you please give us spend time giving us a sense of the landscape of technology and where things are and where they're going. And I said, frankly, can't do it. I could give you a snapshot of it, but what's the point? The point is it's just going to keep changing. Let's just go back here. Obviously, the networks are getting faster, more pervasive, all over the place. We've got connectivity everywhere that we didn't have 10, 15 years ago. Computers, faster, smaller, more functional. We've got them in our pockets. We've got them everywhere. All these things are advancing and continuing to advance, and more importantly, is what's happening with the interconnections between them. Right? That's, in a sense, what the social environments are all about. My role at Google is not just news products. In fact, what pulled me back was the fact that they moved news products into the social division. So I spend as much of my time working on Google Plus and the social layer as I do on news. And the reason that intrigued me was I truly feel that that is where we're going to see far more information consumed than any other environment we know. And we're only at the very first stage. At best, and if somebody's going to write the book of social networking, we're at best in the first chapter today. And I think that's tremendously exciting. And a lot of it is about how do we connect the dots for people between various kinds of information, their own interest, various kinds of individuals, and connect them all together. The first generation of social networking was largely about people you know. It was about friends and family and now business associates. The next generation of social networking is also going to be about people you don't know but probably should, because of your commonality of interest. How can we take and connect these things? So again, as we think about the advance of technology, it's all of this stuff. It's not just the evolution of the technological components, it's the evolution of how these things work together. It's how we connect the dots between advanced databases or a knowledge of your interests, where you are, such that we can blend the right kind of experience. Right? Ultimately, at Google, the kinds of things that we want to do, with that device in your pocket, is not just give you directions, but if we know that you have to be there somewhere this evening, and we've detected that there's particular traffic congestion, maybe you should take another route, let you know about that in advance. Right? We can actually begin to do that sort of thing. So I just raise that to really hit the point that this is not about a point in time. This is about ongoing evolution of technology and the ongoing convergence and exponential convergence of the various connecting points. A lot of what I work on with G+ is the interest graph. It's how do we again, one of the things that my team does in Google+, if you're on Google+, there's no problem if you're not yet. Is we created a stream of content called What's Hot, and we surface some of that content in everyone's stream. And what we're simply doing there, this is a first step in a model that I refer to as programming. It's how do we take and assess the corpus of content to understand what it is and understand where the good stuff is. It's all done algorithmically. How do we then understand the interests of the user, and then how do we program that back to them so that they can discover new and interesting things, right? That's what we're trying to do. It's all, how do we reference crowd behavior to surface new and interesting things and drive new behaviors? Whether that's about the fact that of the Ohio primary today, or the fact that that we've sensed you have a new interest and a new hobby, and we can connect that back to you as well. So lots of interesting things that we can do there to analyze what's going on and help connect people to knowledge that's within their sphere of interest, and help connect people to other individuals who share that same interest that they do. So again, one other thing about technology as well. It is no panacea. Technology in and of itself has no values. Right? It has value, it has potential value, but no values. Important thing to keep in mind. Yes, it can provide great value, but only if we make it so. And I point this out because sometimes I feel that folks look at technology, particularly when they're under impact of disruptive occurrences, to look at technology as a savior. That happened, I think, very specifically with the iPad when it was launched. You had everyone saying, oh, gosh, we can create content apps on the iPad and bring back the old model of people paying for content and having flashy big ads between every article. Nonsense. Really hasn't happened, right? Because the fact is that the ecosystem of content available to us on the web is far richer than our sense of value in a siloed app. right? So most of those content apps, frankly, have not been very successful, right? You cannot, the fact that it appears on an iPad is not going to change the underlying economics of the content economy. And I'll touch on that a bit later. The content economy has been flipped upside down, and no singular device is going to change that. No singular device is going to change people's perceptions of what they should or should not pay for in the sphere of content. The other thing we should think about technology, though, why it's important to understand this, is it defines the palette of the medium that we work in, right? And we've seen that constantly, and we've seen that change just over the last 10 years. And it's important for us to keep exploring and pursuing that. In terms of skills development, again, at another recent conference, someone got up and said, well, you know, gosh, he said, I guess we really shouldn't have been teaching Flash because, you know, Flash seems to be going by the wayside. We wasted a lot of time in our journalism curriculum teaching people Flash. And I went, no, you didn't, not at all. Technologies change. So yeah, maybe yesterday it was Flash and tomorrow it'll be HTML5 and someday later it'll be something else. But I can guarantee you this, and I might say anybody in the room who spent any time learning Flash, you learned skills which convey to other authoring environments, right? You learned how to structure stories in different ways. So every new tool you can learn it. Does that mean that that tool will be there for the rest of your career? Probably not. But in every case, you've learned something that is transferable. And that's very, very important for all of us. And I'll keep coming back to that because not only is the palette define the media, then we use those tools to continue to change the media itself. I want to touch on disruption just a bit. As I said, I really want to make this more about the future than about the past. But there are a few things that I think are important to point out. Because, you know, when we look at what happened with traditional news media, there I think been a lot of inaccurate suppositions about why this was the case, right? Is the newspaper model, was it devastated because Craig Newmark started Craigslist? Well, yes, to a degree, in absolute specific terms. Was damage caused because folks like Google in search and in Google News have links and snippets that drive traffic to news sites? Probably not. The truth is what was the death of the print model, and I say that quite meaningfully. You know, I frankly don't think the newspaper model as we know it cannot stand, right? Flat out. As painful as that might be for folks, and I'll get into some of the specifics, it will not stand. It's anachronistic. It was from a different time and place. And one of the key elements of that different time and place is all about, indeed, what was the trigger to the destruction of that model, which is the open distribution of the internet. It was the internet itself that caused that disruption. Yes, having the existence of the internet allowed Craig Newmark to come up with the idea for Craigslist. Frankly, his idea was much simpler than that. He wasn't thinking, I'm going to create this classified behemoth in every city in America. He did it for friends, right? It's never been in his focus as to how to create it as a business. It just happened. It just happened. Did that devastate the classified ad market for newspapers? No question about it. Right. But similarly, does all that open distribution call all of this, flourishing of all kinds of content sites across the spectrum that have caused to break up the underlying dynamics of the newspaper model? Because when you broke the distribution control, you basically broke the opportunity of old media companies to control pricing. Right. If you look at what made the newspaper model successful, right, it's really tied to that control of distribution. And it wasn't always the case. The other observation that tends to put my hair up is when folks sort of look at the newspaper model and say, but that's the way we get quality news. And that model's been around forever, and we've got to protect that model going forward. Well, the truth is it wasn't around forever. Right? Newspaper models were not always extremely profitable. It was a fiercely competitive business through much of its history. In fact, when we think about the model of the newspaper, one thing I've come to point out recently is when you look at the broadsheet, why was the broadsheet created in the first place? If you go back to the earliest newspapers, because they were putting them up on tavern walls, right? It was actually a social media offering as much as anything else, right? These things evolve over time. So news was fiercely competitive. It stopped being fiercely competitive about 1960. And what caused that? An earlier disruptive technology called television. Right? Because if you look back at that, if you look at the early 50s, you saw a lot of major metropolitan areas that had many newspapers. New York had what, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, depending on how you count them, from their overall size. But television came into place, disrupted the ad markets, disrupted people's consumption habits for news, circulations went down, ad volume went down, and so you saw a constriction of the market. So you went from 5 newspaper towns to 4, to 3, to 2, to 1, maybe 2 with a joint operating agreement, and then you had monopolistic control over pricing for a significant period of time. And that's really what's happening. That's really what's happened. As unfortunate as that might be, I don't, again, it's painful. I know too many people in the business to be callous about about how painful that can be for folks. But in talking about this stuff, I think it's really important for us to kind of get to the core elements here and understand how things are evolving and how things are not evolving. Let's take the romance out of it for the moment, if we can. So disruption, live by it, die by it, is the truth. And that, frankly, is what happened with the newspaper model. Their greatest period of success was driven by the disruptive nature of television. Right? That model was then again disrupted by the nature of the internet because it changed the ad markets completely. And I'll give you just one example about this, and then I want to move on. But just to really hammer the point home. Tiffany's is advertised in the front section of the New York Times forever. The print edition of the New York Times forever. Right? Great news, their best opportunity to get to their demographic in New York. They didn't care that they were next to an article about Darfur, or international news. Didn't care. They were in the front section of the paper. That doesn't happen in the online environment. Does not happen at all. For the simple reason that it's just not a logical spend on Tiffany's part, or any other retailer for that matter, or offerer of products, because in the advertising environment of the web, it's a tremendously open marketplace. And I can pick the demographics. I don't need to go to the New York Times for the New York Times demographics. I can get the New York Times demographics in lots of places. And more importantly, I can get the contextual relevance that makes that ad even more effective. Right? So if I want to advertise, shiny baubles from Tiffany's, well, I might rather do it if I can find that demographic and have in the context of people sort of reading a lifestyle site or whatever with other shiny baubles, they're already in the mindset, right? So that's the kind of effect that we're seeing that is far, far different from what we saw in the traditional business model of a newspaper. Again, feel free to jump in with thoughts, comments, questions. I want to talk a little bit about economics, and not too much, but one of my key points here is that I think that going forward, you do yourself a disservice as a journalist if you do not understand the business dynamics of the businesses that you work for or are starting. You just have to. And this is not about taking down the wall between the business side and the editorial side, right? I trust that any institution looking to do good journalism respects the fact that if they don't have the trust of the audience, if they make the wrong decisions to maintain the trust of the audience, they're not going to have that audience for long, right? So let's not get a pursuit of proper ethics to cause us to be blind about the underlying dynamics of the business itself. And that's largely what we've seen, right? I've for many years talked to folks on the journalistic side who are just like, even thinking about the business side was a problem. I remember in the early days of the internet, just the fact that we were sharing measurement statistics about who read what story or how many people were reading individual stories was considered like, oh, I don't want to know that. Gee, that might affect our news judgment. Really? I mean, let's not tear down our own responsibility to adhere to our missions as an excuse to avoid consuming and understanding the data that we need to help mold what we're doing, right? Same for things like SEO, right? When I took over Salon, we said, look, we've got to do a better job of configuring our content such that search engines can find it. So yeah, we got to be clever about what we do. We got to be clever about what terms we use. And you can say, well, oh, but that's an unseemly pursuit of traffic. And I say, unseemly pursuit of traffic? What is our objective as journalists? but to come up with knowledgeable observations about what's going on in the space and get that into as many heads as possible. So if that means that it's better for us to spell healthcare reform with one word for healthcare versus two, because that will actually give us better prominence as things rise in search, why wouldn't we do that, right? It's the furtherance of our core objective. So very important that we understand these underlying dynamics. I'll come back to some of that stuff later. So the truth is, there is no standard business model. And there is no standard business model that's going to replace the old, right? It's going to be a mishmash of things, from commercial revenue sources, conceivably, to nonprofit revenue sources, depending on the category of content. You know, micropayments are certainly not going to be a macro solution. People are continuing to explore them. Good. For certain areas, they may work. That has not proven to be the case. Average ad CPMs will vary by category. In general, they're significantly lower than what we saw in the previous print media, primarily for the reason I cited earlier. We have a very, very open economy in the ad marketplace without any distribution control, so it's extremely competitive. So yes, CPMs, the whole notion of exchanging digital dimes for analog dollars, absolutely the case, without question. Subscription fees will work, but only if the content has extraordinary value. And I think that's one of the, I don't personally believe in the paywall model as a savior for news organizations. I'm not saying it can't be a part of the mix. I think what the New York Times has done is quite wise. It's a very porous model. They're not putting up a hard wall. But there's no way that that's going to generate enough money, even if they put up a hard wall. There's no way it'll generate enough money to cover the cost of their operations. And so you've got to keep looking at various things. But the whole business is going to change in significant ways. So just a couple of rule of thumbs that I've used is what do you assume, as your revenue per thousand page views? I mean, just a couple of rules of thumb, right? And when I was at Salon, it was about $10. Right. What that meant is just sort of standard business process. If your revenue per thousand page views is $10, then the cost of your product, as it were, better be less than half of that. So it was, well, how do we get the cost per thousand page views to under $5? Right. And in my time there, between all the finagling we did, I'm not sure how things are there now, but we did. It was $10 on the RPM side. We brought the cost per MQV from $9.50 down to like $5.75. And even then, we were still losing business because we had other costs of the business besides just the cost of creating the content. But here's the challenge for a major newspaper. If you actually took, and that was actually based on the New York Times, because I did some work with the New York Times when I was at Google in 07 and 08. And that data might be different now, but it's still an appropriate rough order of magnitude. If I took a look, and I happen to know that their revenue per thousand page views now is about between $15 and $20. They've had a couple of very good years because they're very big, and they've been able to really do a good job of generating additional ad revenue. But still, their cost per thousand page views is way beyond that, right? And this really speaks to the challenge of evolving that business. And I'll touch more on that in the future, further on in this talk, in terms of what. Is the newspaper model in and of itself truly something that can withstand? And when you look at numbers like this, obviously it raises some pretty significant questions. In the new world, it's less about demographics, and as I was saying earlier with the example about Tiffany's, it's more about context and relevance. You can get the demographics in all places. You can find the context and relevance that's appropriate to your product. And again, the marketplace for eyeballs is very disaggregated and very open and extremely competitive. Now, in the past, with the newspaper model, cross-subsidization was crucial, right? The truth is the local news did not bring in the revenue. The investigative reporting did not bring in the revenue. What brought in the revenue was the classified section. What brought in the revenue was the gardening section, the automotive section, the lifestyle section, the soft sections, right? Because that's what the advertisers really wanted to be against. Now, the unfortunate challenge in the news space, and this is why I think the whole notion of the newspaper model, as we've seen, frankly, can't really go forward significantly, is that now, and I did this at Salon, I said, look, it's hard for me to sell ads at premium CPMs against political commentary, right? Plain and simple, because if you, whatever, and we had, high-class advertisers, but And from Lexus's perspective, saying, well, why do I want to be next to the political stuff? I really want to be next to the lifestyle stuff, where, again, people's thought processes are in a different way. So you get lower CPMs for hard news, higher CPMs for soft news. So we did more soft stuff. We added new sections like food and so on and so forth. But that, too, is not an easy solution, because the truth is we have this very rich content ecosystem out there today. And so in every one of these cases, you've got niche products focused on just those categories, right? I mean, who today thinks about, if you're thinking about, gee, I need to find some recipes, right? 15 years ago, yeah, you might have pulled out the food section from the Sunday paper, right? Where do you go today? You go to Epicurious, you go to, I mean, there are just dozens of sites where you'll go. People are going to Pinterest now for recipes. Very, very different environment. Right? There's a company out there called Sugar Media, who some of you might know. They're basically, they look at themselves as the future of Condé Nast for fashion. Right? Their burning focus is on women from 18 to 32. You know, and it's all about Manolo Blahniks and little black dresses and whatever, whatever, whatever. And it's perfect, obviously, for the advertisers who are interested in that demographic. Right? So that's why I say down here, you know, does that cover everything model of a newspaper? Is that not anachronistic? And my sense is it is, because it was from a time and place where that was your vehicle. You go back 20 years and you wanted, you know, current events information of any type, from hard news to fashion, you bought your paper, right? But now you've got everything from everywhere else. And so, and we're beginning to see you know, local newspapers and their online versions of themselves beginning to alter how they do things. You know, such that if they're going to spend money on creating valuable editorial content, then focus on where they can be different, not where they're doing stuff that is available in other places. You know, to the point where you're seeing, you know, John Patton in the Journal Register papers, right? They basically removed all of the soft content from local editorial responsibility and are doing it all centrally, because they realize they just can't make it work the other way. And what they want is the local editorial organizations to focus on local editorial content, right? It doesn't have to be about recipes or movie reviews. That can be in a lot of different places. But what this says to the folks in this room, because obviously you're not necessarily all going into doing hard news, right? You know, so when I look at the landscape of opportunity out there, you know, you're not just thinking from a career perspective about working for the electronic edition of a newspaper. There are dozens and thousands of sites producing interesting content on every dimension of the content spectrum, you know, who are looking for talented, creative people who can help move them forward. So there's a lot of opportunity out there. Again, these are difficult times. I don't want to overstress that, but the fact of the matter is we have a very rich content ecosystem out there that do represent opportunities. Now let's look at the audience and understand where that comes from. And this too has basically been flipped on its head. Because in the old model of news, basically people came to you, right? They bought the paper, they took it home, they spent time with it. Now, as we know, it's all over the place. And the truth is that overloaded content ecosystem, the battle for eyeballs is waged on the user's terms, right? And you just have to go with it, right? We're seeing that phenomenon particularly with regard to the social networks, right? In fact, let's look at some interesting data. And let's see what this tells us. So this is a little bit of an eye chart, but let me see if I can take you through this, all right? And this is, I've sort of rounded this data from a number of sites that I had familiar data for. I didn't feel comfortable labeling its specific source, but it is rule of thumb accurate. 2009, say a typical news site was seeing 45% of their traffic come to the front page of the site. Right? They were coming to me. Look what happened over time. And in search, at that time, 22% was coming from search. You know, because they search for something, and by the way, Google News is not really about news.google.com. That's just one iteration. What we basically operate is this engine that generates, that surfaces, harvests and surfaces the latest articles about anything. And we do that around the world. And we fuel that into various Google properties, most significantly search. Right. So when you do a Google search for like Obama and a little package comes up, says news results for Obama, that comes out of Google News. As a result, we put news in front of about 1 billion people a week around the globe in 72 countries and 54 languages, with something in excess of 50,000 news sites as part of the news sites that we harvest. But so just to give you a sense, so search was 22% of the inbound traffic. Referrals, meaning links on other sites like blogs and so on, 32%. Social, 1%. Right, typical news site 3 years ago. Look where it is now. Direct traffic to the homepage. And by the way, in all these cases, the audience, this is share of audience. So let's just assume that the cumulative audience went up, which is also typically true. Cumulative audience went up, but where that audience was coming from changed. 25% came direct to the homepage. 33% coming from search. Referrals from third-party sites, pretty much the same. Social, up to 15%. Right? Now, there are sites out there that are, there are news sites out there that are, Huffington Post, I believe, gets something in excess of 20% of their traffic from social media. Right? Now, the reason I raise that is there a lesson in here? As I ask at the top, what does this tell us about site design? Right? What is the most important page on your news site? The hint is in here. 25% comes to the home page. 75% goes to article pages. Article pages. Right. What does that tell us about site design? In every site design I've gone through, 90% of the focus goes to the home page. Right? Because this is the shiny front of your site. Everyone puts a tremendous amount of attention on design of the homepage because I think that's where we make our first impression. That's where we direct the users to where they need to go. And I'm not saying it's not important, but designing that story page, which is the first entry into your site for huge numbers of people, is really where you should give a lot of focus, right? Because once we get them, a lot of traffic coming in from search, they come for an article and they may never come back. So your objective, of course, is how do you get them to come in for one article and expose them to enough of your value proposition, either about that story or about other things that you cover, that you get them to read not one article, but 3, that you get them to think, this is a pretty cool site and I want to come back again, right? But if you look at most news sites, the story pages are the least functional, least attractive, least appealing in the mix. And that's simply an error in understanding audience flows and how we need to change the thought process going forward. Question.
What do you know about those second page views? That is, once somebody comes in and finds an article page, where do they go after that? I run a local news website, and I'm finding that a very high number of people go to our front page after they find an article page. But I suspect that that's probably strictly because we're so local that it's not relevant to the average news site. And then I guess the other thing is, what do you know about the differences? Does this represent a one-time visitor or a recurring visitor? And what do you know about how recurring visitors utilize sites and how they come back to sites?
Well, this mix represents, say, a share of audience over the course of, say, a month, right? That's typically was the data period that we would look at. So if I looked at inbound traffic, say uniques, where were they coming from? This was the mix. If you look at your loyal visitors at Salon, for instance, you got a loyal audience that's coming every day, twice a day, and they're coming to your homepage, right? Because they like your product. Right, so this is primarily for your loyal audience. You want, in absolute volume numbers, you want more people coming here. But my point is recognizing that most of your inbound traffic and most of your new potential users are coming through the story page, and you want to make a better effort at figuring out how you can convert them. It's all about conversion. I mean, that's been my big point when folks say, like that old meme that, for instance, Google is stealing our content by putting headlines and snippets on the page. And my response back, in fact, when I was at Salon, I was on a panel and that discussion came up. And Krishna Bharat, the founder of Google News, happened to be with me. And I took out every bit of cash in my pocket and I handed it to Krishna. I said, if I could pay Krishna for any possible boost in ranking in Google News, I'd do it in a heartbeat. It's my newsstand, right? And in the news business, you always paid to be put on the newsstand. You paid to put news boxes on the street. right? And now, people understand that. At least in the United States, U.S. publishers now understand how things like search and social fit into the ecosystem. But it took a while to get there. Understandably, I don't say that critically. Structure and form. One of the things that Marshall McLuhan said was that every new medium begins as a container for the old. Right? And probably a very good example of that is you go back to the days of radio, and you had, you have somebody come on and basically read the newspaper, and then they realize, well, actually, the structure and style and the form of news writing for a newspaper versus radio is completely different. It's shorter sentences, so on and so forth. And so the media form for radio evolved as differently from the media form for print. Clear. I think this is equally true in this space here. And there's one area where, frankly, I think not enough has been done, which I think is frankly a bit disappointing. And I sort of understand why, and I'll touch on that a bit. But it need not be the case for folks who are coming into this business fresh. I can understand how hard it is because I worked with many of them. If you've been doing things a certain way for 20 years, it's very hard to get yourself to think about how you do it differently. Even if someone is giving you free creative reign to do that. So I understand that. I don't say this critically. But the truth is the environment is different, and our approaches to how we create and present and structure content need to be different as well for many, many reasons. And let's touch on just a couple of things in that regard. One is rethinking the content architecture. And this has been an area, this actually is a slide. This slide is about 5 years old. And I keep bringing it back because there just has not been enough movement in the space. And part of the recognition here was that, again, because of things like search and social, is really recognizing that core unit of content is the story page itself. And one of the key observations I made, and this was back when I was at Google several years ago, was, if I looked at, this was the anthrax attack back in, I can't remember when that was, right? And if I did Google search on the anthrax attack, what popped up as #1 consistently was Wikipedia, because they had this really excellent fixed URL, 5,000 word compendium on the anthrax attacks. Right? I mean, Wikipedia is a pretty marvelous resource. Interestingly, the Washington Post, who probably did more coverage on that story than any other single publication, was on page 2 of the search results and never seemed to rise above that. Right? And why was this? One simple dynamic was they had a fixed URL that they kept building, right? They just kept adding content to this such that it was a living story, as it were. In fact, the Living Story project at Google sort of came out of that. Whereas what the Washington Post was doing, understandably, because it's the way they had always done things, was they were firing off daily articles, each with their own URL, most of which disappeared in the archive 3 days after they were published, right? So there was no cumulative knowledge being built against a singular URL, right? So this, to me, is one key thought process about changing one's architectural approach to content structure. Rethink both the form and instructions. It's not about additions. It's not about ephemeral streams of articles. Yes, there might be frequent updates and daily updates to the story, but what does that mean in terms of the presentation of the content? One of the things that Larry Page said to me a few years ago, who is as bright as you can imagine and loves to challenge you with thoughts. He says, why don't news sites recognize my read state? It's the kind of thing Larry will say. My first thought was like, read state? Fortunately, I managed to connect the dots quickly enough that I didn't have to ask him the question like, what the hell does read state mean? But he said, why doesn't it know that I went to that page before, that I've been following this article, and simply make sure that what I get presented is what I need to know? And what I've seen before is secondary. I mean, that's a pretty advanced thought process on where one might go with this. But it's a valid observation about it, right? So why aren't we building, my view is like, if there's a beat that a reporter is working on, why does not the full compendium of knowledge that reporter has be represented in a page? And I'll give you an interesting story about this that just was fascinating and frustrating at the same time. And I won't describe the publication, but it was a major news publication, and they came to me and they said, and I was at Google, and they said, can you help us with a problem because our topic pages are consistently beat by Wikipedia. And what they were really asking, in truth, was, can you put your finger on the scale? You know, can you change the ranking algorithm? And that's just not, that is so not what we ever do. And I said, that ain't going to happen. But by the way, I will tell you, not, you know, to be polite, and this is someone who I've known for years and years and years, I said, but the truth is your topic pages kind of suck. Right? And they suck because, A, they were on the side. It was a secondary thing, right? They weren't the topic page. My view of a topic page is that's where that, if the anthrax article from the Washington Post should actually surface as the topmost item on that page that's all about the anthrax attacks. So that every time somebody comes and reads an update about that story, what they're seeing is the availability of everything else about that story, building that pyramid of knowledge, right? And so in this case, that news organization, topic pages were way off to the side somewhere, couldn't even find them. So they weren't getting much traffic or link references, and they weren't kept up to date, right? They did not reflect the latest knowledge, right? Whereas if you look at Wikipedia, the things, bizarrely and magically, someone updates these things consistently. And so they said, fine, okay, fair enough on your observation, let's do a test. And so they quickly took, and we took 15 topic pages and they changed the model, updated them regularly and so on and so forth. And sure enough, 2 months later, those 15 topic pages were dramatically increased in the rankings, and in many cases were beating Wikipedia. They were really happy about it, such to the point that I even got an email from the publisher saying, thanks a lot for our help, that was really great. Right. Step one. Step two was, he said, so now we have to figure out how we do that for all of our topic pages, all 1,500 topic pages. Exactly. And they came back, and I met with them again a couple of months later and said, well, we went through that, and we figured it's going to cost us about $10 million a year. And I went, gulp, and I said, why? And he said, because we got to hire another 100 rewrite people. And I went, 100 rewrite people? Yeah, so they can keep the pages up to date. And I went, well, wait a second. Wait a second. You've got, on any given beat, you've got at least a reporter and at least part of an editor whose focus is on that beat. And in many cases, and with that news organization, it was many more. So why does not, this sort of gets to that digital first versus digital second argument that you have in some of these news organizations. Like, why does not the reporter who's running that beat own that page? Why is not that page on that beat the fullest expression of their knowledge and expertise at any given point in time? Like, they craft it, they update it, they own it. And what you pull from it might be what happens, it appears in your print edition the next day, as long as you're running a print edition, not the other way around. But in their culture and in their workflow, it was the other way around. All the focus was on creation of the fresh article that was going to appear in the print edition, and everything else was somebody else's problem, right? I mean, in fact, one of the things I've been observing to folks lately is like, you know, I think what would help the news ecosystem the most is if some very clever group of people basically created Reporter's Notebook 2.0, right? What's the set of tools that I've got on my portable device, whatever that device is now and in the future, that helps me gather and organize and structure all of my knowledge about a story such that I can very easily parse out what I should publish, what I should keep behind, and do it consistently and frequently and purely. You know, that would be a very significant advance. But that gets to some of the issues of not only how do we look at content architecture, but how do we look at workflow in organizations. I suspect we're not going to be having, I hope to God I'm not having discussions about this slide 10 years from now, much less even 5 years from now. And I like to think, again, folks in this room who are going out in this space with much fresher thoughts and no bias of pre-existing experience can look at this in a new way and say, no, this is the way we should do it from the start. Right. So again, this is somewhat of a repetitive slide. How can we build that, maintain that pyramid of knowledge about the story? How do we understand and address the user's read state? What is the role of the long-form article? And here too, this is where I say, rethink the form. You know, I had the tremendous pleasure a couple of months ago to do a conversation at Google with Lewis Lapham. I love Lewis Lapham, brilliant guy, and he's a lot older than I am, which not many people I can say that about these days. And the reason I love him is that he thinks about the structure of the form. right? This is the guy who created Harper's Index, right? This is the guy who does the wonderful Lapham's Quarterly, if you haven't seen it, print vehicle, but just really a brilliant publication. And he does truly recognize the difference between short and long, and the value between short and long, when it's appropriate, when it's not. And he, was very quick to point out, that the barrier to creating a great reading experience for an article over 2,000 words is very, very high and very, very risky. And I love a long read when a long read is good. But that doesn't mean a long read is appropriate for everything. So it's like, how do we rethink that form? Here we are in an age of Twitter, of PowerPoint, of Twitter, of Pinterest, where we seem to be reducing the units of content exploration and sharing to tiny nuggets, yet at this end we're still thinking about 3,000 word articles. I will get up and cheer the first time I see bullet points in an article. Why don't we have bullet points in an article? Why don't we, anything, just rethink the structure and form, start to do things in a different way. I'm not saying what the answer is, by any means. And it's easy for me to criticize. As I said, I don't consider myself a journalist because I never reported a story. I've run news sites and so on and so forth, even as editor-in-chief, but I never wrote a story. So hard for me, I want to be cautious in here I criticize. I'm not the one doing the work. But at the same time, making an observation from an architecture and ecosystem perspective, to continue down the path that we've been on for the last 30 years, because that's the way it was done in the previous form, is not logical. Right? We really need to rethink that. ProPublica, for instance, does an interesting thing. When we had one of these wonderful news food camps several months ago, and one of the sessions I put together was oh, it's right there on the slide. What's the role of the social network post? And I didn't know really what would happen. That's the wonderful thing about news foods. You throw a question out and you engage with it and discuss it with a lot of smart people. One of the things that ProPublica does, which I think is very, very smart, right? They do really solid investigative journalism, really thorough stuff. I might argue that some of their pieces are too long and so on and so forth, but fair enough. They do some interesting, clever things. What they do when they launch one of their new reports is they take and do not just a single post about the article. They'll do a series of posts over time, and each one is a nugget of information from that article. Right? They just got to break out key nuggets of knowledge, such that they recognize that, yes, they hope that they will drive links, drive clicks on the links and come to the site, but maybe they won't. Maybe they won't. But at least they're conveying nuggets of knowledge at every step along the way, right? Which is really important, just a sort of a clever thought process about how one changes their look at the medium, at the output, and how they represent it to various audiences. Yes?
Isn't that at odds with persistent URL of Wikipedia?
No, their URL stayed the same. Their URL stayed the same. All they were doing is when they would put up a Facebook post or a Google Plus post, they were doing series of them. And all of them kept pulling people back to the same URL. But they were also recognizing, there's this interesting thing, which is one of the things that we're struggling to try to address, that I would love to address in our work with Google Plus, is as powerful as social networking is to driving audiences, it leaves a lot of audience on the floor. Because if Nick Bilton from the Times does an article and does a post on that article, you might get 5,000 people to engage with that post, right? He wrote some sort of clever little synopsis, and they engage with that and they discuss it. So maybe 5,000 people engage, but maybe only 1,000 people actually click on the link. And one of the reasons for that is simply there's this perceived high expense of exiting that environment. So are there things that we can do that to sort of better bridge that experience? But no, it's not out of sync with creating a persistent destination on a beat. Computational journalism, this to me is also another huge untapped opportunity, particularly when we think about investigative reporting. And I'll cite one of my favorite examples, and this too is a very old example. I don't know if you probably know of a site called everyblock.com that basically pulls data from various local sources of information, everything from restaurants being shut down for reasons of hygiene to crimes in the neighborhood, and they pull all that together. The guy who founded that is a guy named Adrian Halvardi. Well, back at this time here, Adrian Halvardi was an intern at the Washington Post. And the Washington Post was doing sort of a classic in-depth investigative report, in this case on the state of the DC schools. And in the end result was a 3-part series, 30,000 words, great, probably 15,000 people read it. Important thing to do, because it's not about how many people read it, it's in many cases who reads it. But one of the things that they also did, that Adrian did as an intern, was built a site on the DC schools that took all of the data that they had gathered, such that I could actually go into that site, go to a specific school where my kid was, and find out everything about that school. What the average grade point average was, what issues they had had with crime in the school, so on and so forth, all of there. A very powerful resource. And the cool thing about that, you look at that and you say, gosh, that would be a great ongoing resource, a great living resource on the state of the schools. Not this snapshot in time, which was the only way you could do it in old media. But in new media, you can do things differently. And with computational journalism, you can do things differently. Right? And in this case, not true at all, but in this case, you can actually say, you know, and that actually yields some interesting data that might help us monetize. Because frankly, everyone who goes in there, what do I know? I know you've got, if they go click on a school in this district here, I know where they live, I know that they've got kids in school, that might actually influence what kinds of ads I can surface. Now that's not true of any investigative reporting story, but it was definitely true of this one. Now the problem here was, as brilliant as Adrian was in creating it, again, he was an intern, they never maintained it. You know, it's a dead site. And it shouldn't be. You know, and I'm not saying, you know, I don't want to just criticize the Washington Post, but my whole point there is there are opportunities in the use of computational journalism to do some very, very powerful things. In terms of data mining, in terms of looking for anomalies in sources of public data, to really truly help do your computational reporting, and in terms of yielding end products which can be ongoing repertorial sources that are effectively automated. Right? That's powerful. So when we look at the future of investigative journalism, and obviously there's a lot of interesting stuff going on there. I love the kind of stuff that ProPublica are doing. I love the stuff that Rosie is doing with CIR. But the truth is, there's also a big set of opportunities in the area of computational journalism. So, you know, one of the things I keep in talking to journalism schools is like, hopefully as you build your cross-functional curriculum, you can get people exposed to as many dimensions of this problem as possible. Such that one of the things that comes out of these J schools is journalism students who have computer science degrees. You know, who can play both sides of the equation. That's a very powerful thing. So this is when I look forward and say the future of journalism will be better than the past, this is a big part of why that can be so. We're not doing it today, but we have the opportunity to do it going forward, and I think we'll see some very powerful things going forward with these kinds of concepts. Architecture. Product development cannot stop. And that's true based on what I said earlier, right? Things keep changing. You have to keep rethinking things all the time. And part of that has to be getting the journalists themselves, everyone involved in that organization, thinking about the product. And that isn't true in the past, and it's understandable. When I went back to Salon a few years ago, and we did a redesign of the site, and I tried very hard to get, and interestingly with Salon, because it's been an online-only publication since its founding in 1995. But it was very, very hard to get the editorial team to really think about the product, to think about the features of the product. And my only conclusion from that was simply that they've never had the opportunity to think about product in that way. Right? They just never had. You know, and I can understand that particularly with folks who most of their experience has been in traditional media. Because when you think about, quotes, the newspaper, the form and function of a newspaper hasn't changed in 150 years. Right? You added color, ink, you know, nice shinier paper to print on. But the truth is, it's leaves of pages, it's indexes of stories, and so on. Hasn't really changed in form or function. Not true online. In fact, online it's changing all the time. You know, so the reason I raised that about the history of newspapers, so understandable why people who came out of that realm never really thought about, quotes, product. Maybe that's the wrong term, but the design of the vehicle through which they convey knowledge and information, right? Whereas that really, hopefully, won't be the case going forward. You know, and back to that earlier point about innovation, that everyone's thinking about how can we evolve this. Like with the editors, I was saying, well, you know, you're responsible for this area. You help tell us what you think the features should be I didn't want to be simply, from my position saying, here's what it should be. I want you guys to generate thoughts as well. And that's why I was so disappointed in a sense about a lot of the lack of grasping of can we play around with the narrative form. I mean, at Salon, we did change it slightly, but only in length, and only because I kept surfacing data that's saying that, every article that we do that's over 1,500 words, only 28% or 25% of the people finish it. So what does that say about what we're doing if our objective is to communicate? And it's not say you don't ever do long-form articles, but let's, again, think carefully about how we convey information in a way that maps with the behaviors of today's audience, which is dramatically different. Whether we like it or not, it's dramatically different. I want to go into just a couple of last points. In one, I think this is, to me, this sort of gets more to our sense of mission with journalism. This is a very different world. And one thing that's true about the internet, and I think we see this in spades, is that the internet, because of its accessibility, because of the fact that everyone can publish, as I said, technology has no values, right? Just because it has great power doesn't mean it will always be used for good. One thing about the internet that is absolutely true is that it will indeed support any opinion, any belief, and indeed amplify it, right? And we've seen that time and again. You see that with, whether it's the birthers or whatnot, right? You see people promulgating bad information that reinforces people's beliefs and amplifies them. It's not, I don't think humanity has changed. I don't think human behavior has changed. It's just that the internet has made it so easy for people to find things that reinforce their beliefs, right? And the unfortunate truth, as Clay Johnson says, is like, who wants to hear the truth when they can hear that they are right? And the problem here, of course, is that we've got media sources out there who feed on that, right? Then we have to go into who they are. We know who they are, right? And that's deeply unfortunate. But I think it does, also cause us to really think differently about our own mission and tactics as journalists, right? I mean, how do we, given that, in a sense, greater need for media literacy and cognitive reasoning, how does that change how we approach things? How does it change how we approach building a sense of trust, right? One of the things, for instance, that I have, I continue to try to challenge folks on is news organizations, I think, for too long have basically felt that you should trust us because we are us, right? And I don't think that doesn't work anymore. I'm not sure it ever worked. And if you look at the consumer research on people's trust in news media, it's pretty clear. I mean, it's like incredibly low. You're talking about under 25%, right? So something has to change. And when I hear news organizations, for instance, I think it's the old Len Downey approach, I don't vote, or you should not disclose your political affiliation. So let me get this right. You want to build credibility on the part of you and the audience by masking facts about yourself. Seems a little bit retro to me, and certainly not appropriate to this new environment, right? So how do we build trust? And that gets down to, I think, also form and structure. Another thing that Larry Page said to me was, why don't journalists footnote their work? Fairly reasonable question, right? They seem to assume that just because they wrote it in the article, I have to believe that that's true. They might have pulled an observation out of a source of data, but they haven't actually shared with me the source of data. Right?
Aren't hyperlinks now kind of the de facto thing? I mean, so many people do that now.
In a sense, they are. We are seeing more of that in the form of hyperlinks. In some, it's not always true with the hyperlink that it's the source of information, but yes, we're seeing more of it. Absolutely. So I don't mean to suggest that no progress has been made, but his point is like, I trust articles in like scientific publications because there's a lot of displayed rigor as to the source of the underlying information and the conclusions that have been reached off of that information. And shouldn't that be true in the news space as well? And I think it's just a valid observation, right? And back to that point of how do we build trust, right? For instance, every reporter's byline should be linked to their biography and theoretically to every article they've ever written, right? If I just look at that and maybe read more articles, I have a better sense of that individual, right? The trust, to me, the trust of media is no longer about the brand, it's about the individual. especially given what I said about the nature of the ecosystem. So how do we build trust in the individual? How do we build trust in that personal brand? Very important. One of the things that Google is starting to do is surface authorship in search results. Wherever we can surface, like, who was the author on this? Because we just want to reinforce that good knowledge tends to come from good authors and good expertise. And where we can identify that expertise and surface it is to the better end of the recipient of that information. So moving forward, a couple of just closing points. Again, the old news model is in trouble because everyone now has a printing press. Yep, and that cannot be a bad thing. Right? It's a whole new world. I think it's a better world, and you guys will create it. As I say here, journalism future will be molded by many new creative endeavors. I mean, this is the interesting thing with disruption, is in every case, if you look at disruptive effects, and they've been happening forever in new technologies, whether it was railroads or telephone companies or whatever, and every time you see technological disruption, the old dominant players are not the new dominant players. Right? And why is that the case? It's because it's very, very hard, near impossible, for the old dominant players to, as I say, eat their own young. Right? You can't do it. It's like telling, somebody said to me recently, they said, you know, why didn't, when Craigslist was becoming popular, why didn't the newspapers change their model with regard to classifieds? You know, and it's a fair observation. But if you put yourself in the seat of that CEO of that news company circa 1998, you know, whose family ownership took the company public in 1987, you know, such that they now have to answer to the street for their short-term earnings, and you're telling me that the CEO is going to get up in front of the analyst and say, oh, by the way, we've decided to turn the cash cow into a freebie so that we can appropriately compete in the new ecosystem. Very, very hard thing to ask. So, you know, I can't criticize folks for not doing that. It's a near impossible position to be in. So whenever you see disruptions occur, the old players do not become the dominant players in the new. And if they make the transition at all, it's usually because they acquired new properties to allow them to be so. And so the reason is you've got all of these new entities, you know, whether it's ProPublica or Huffington Post or whatever area of the internet you find, it's always the hungry new entrepreneurs who start with a clean slate. They have nothing to answer for. They have no business model to try to defend, no past practice to try to defend. They have an absolutely clean slate, and such that they move things forward. And that's going to happen in the new space as well. It's happening already, and we're going to see it continue to happen as we evolve forward. And again, hopefully it's the folks in this room who contribute to that. The role of the journalist and the tools and skills they use will continue to change, embrace that, as I was saying, right? If we want to move the form, if we want to change how we do things, then the role has to change. The very nature of what people do in their day-to-day roles in an organization or in a small site change. And it's important to embrace that. And again, when I talk to journalism students, it's like, yes, you know, learn how to write. You got to learn how to write. But, you know, everything else you can learn, whether it's about, you know, Flash or HTML5 or whatever the new authoring environment is, or whether it's about crafting videos or doing informational graphics or computational journalism, try them all, explore them all. You know, you may settle on one versus the other, but you'll have that interesting knowledge base that will help you evolve forward as these tools continue to change. And last, journalism's future will be stronger than its past. And I think given what I've said about the nature of the ecosystem, the truth is it really needs to be so. It's important that it be so. And I just hope that you know, all of us can help contribute to that being the case. But the only way to get there, frankly, is to recognize that change is important, is to recognize that innovation matters, and to recognize that risk-taking matters, because that's what's going to allow us to figure out the new models and the new forms that will actually yield the kind of ecosystem that we want to have. It will be a very noisy ecosystem, right? I mean, we're very definitely moving from a period that was dominated by large media entities. And I think that is very clearly going to be less and less the case, because we've got the opportunity for many, many voices to participate. And I think that's great. I think that's great in every area of the environment, including investigative journalism. You know, Because one thing, that's too, is one of these sort of romantic notions. People say, well, gosh, newspapers are responsible for investigative journalism, and where's that going to come from? And I say, well, wait a second. Let's really kind of look at the hardcore facts here. You know, I still want somebody to do an audit of the news and information environment circa 1985 and the news and information environment today, and just compare the differences and show us where the holes are. And I think we're going to see in many areas that it's much, much richer today. And the holes are probably very few. I'm not saying they don't exist, but they're very few. But the investigative journalism one is a kind of an interesting. I say, well, wait, if you look at it, in its heyday, how many investigative journalists did the Boston Globe have? 3, 4, 5? And now you have an ecosystem that allows everyone to participate. And the one thing I think we know from the past, even with investigative journalism, mainstream media was not really, you know, the strongest source of investigative journalism because they had interests to protect. You know, just calling it what it is. They did great work. They didn't always do everything that could be done. And because the truth is that a lot of investigative journalism came from the fringe. You know, one of my early heroes was I.F. Stone. And you know, I remember meeting him very early in my career when I worked for PBS, and we acquired a documentary about I.F. Stone, and I got a chance to have lunch with him. Interesting thing about it was that day he had actually he had gotten a Xerox machine. This was like 1975 or so. He got a Xerox machine, cost a lot of money. I think it was one of these leased things, you know. And this was magic to him because he produced a newsletter, you know, that had been like, you know, done in very different ways. So it was interesting to do that on a day where he was kind of getting a little bit of new technology for publishing, as it were. But, you know, at its height, I.F. Stone's Weekly, I don't think ever had more than 10,000 subscribers. But he affected the news agenda because he would break stories that caused other media entities to take notice. It has always been that case. We've always had this level of cascading effect from fringe journalistic efforts into the mainstream arena. And I think we're going to see that in spades even further as we go forward. I don't mean to paint this as a panacea, not at all. I know there are a lot of challenges, a lot of hurdles, and a lot of hurt along the way. But the truth is the opportunities are tremendous. And I think we have the ability in all the key points to build an ecosystem that is richer than we've had in the past, that is more democratic, more engaging in all kinds of ways. And I just look forward to seeing the kind of efforts that will come out of folks in this room. Apologize for speaking so long, and I hope we still have time for enough questions.
Again, I want to thank Richard Gingras for giving us, I think, an inspirational and educational lecture today. At this time, exactly, should we take some, can we take a few questions? And because we have a mixed audience, I would love to ask you to stand up and say if you're a San Francisco State journalism student or you're coming from one of our professional publications, outlets, and then ask your question. Let's start in the back with your hand up.
Yes. Armando Rodriguez, PC World. I am actually a San Francisco State student. What's the biggest change that Google News brought to the journalism realm, in your opinion?
I think probably simply the propagation of a wide array of content to more people than they'd ever had access to before. You know, and the ability for folks to far more easily get a deeper perspective on a story from multiple sources, you know, simply for what we bring together in that regard. I think that's frankly the most significant thing. And as I said earlier, trying to connect the dots between people's interest in a subject and connecting that with a knowledgeable, highly regarded source of information that was our objective and our mission. And I think, you know, to no small degree, we've accomplished a big part of that. You know, continues to evolve. You know, our focus now is increasingly on how do we find the best and freshest content and do it really, really fast. Interesting, inside Google, we only get noticed, I think, when we make a mistake. You know, and making a mistake for us is not that we didn't get the story right, because you guys write the stories, but did we, you know, when Steve Jobs dies, you know, how many minutes pass before somebody executes a Google search and we've got an excellent article available for them? You know, and it better be measured in short minutes. It's kind of amazing. I mean, I love algorithmic work, and I love working with the very talented engineers we have. it's tremendous fun.
Great. You have a question?
Yes.
Actually, the woman right here.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Mette. I'm from Denmark. I used to work in Denmark as a journalist. Now I'm taking a semester here at State University. As a very young journalist, I see you speaking about this from a very business perspective. I would ask you to explain what you mean when you say that the role of the future journalist will be stronger or better than its past, because I am very concerned about the level of my personal journalism. If I also do have to have business skills and technology skills, because it would give me less time to research ideas, writing, and that's why I want to be a journalist.
Yeah, well, let me make sure I clarify on that. What I say about the business side is you shouldn't be spending any significant part of your day on the business side. I'm just saying have an understanding and a knowledge of how your business works. Where does the revenue come from? How does what you do impact that, or they impact you? Just have an understanding of it. That's really all I'm asking. And as far as the technologies and tools, again, you could be the best judge of how you go with that, but clearly we're seeing evolution of the form. And in some of these regards, technology is important. As I said, computational journalism isn't going to get done by computer scientists. It's going to get done by journalists who have enough sensibility with computer science, if not the coding skills themselves, to do great stuff. I've been following, the Guardian has done some marvelous stuff in this regard. I'm forgetting the fellow's name, Simon, can't remember, but they did this wonderful thing recently where they analyzed tweets, and particularly rumors via tweets, and how they were corrected over time around the London riots. I mean, there's just a lot of very interesting stuff that can be done.
But when you say that the future of journalists is going to be stronger and better, does that mean better quality, or does that mean more stories for the reader to choose against?
I actually like to think all of those things. I mean, I like to think overall that that quality on average, not that there's obviously very high quality work today, and hopefully high quality work will continue, if not be on average higher. Who knows? Hard to say about the quality thing. We certainly have more participants, and more participants is a good thing. People coming at it from different angles. We're seeing coverage of various industries happen that never happened before, because they weren't the people to do it, right? And now, if you go to any industry, whether it's bioscience, you name the niche, and you'll go out and you'll find very thoughtful blogs or whatever you want to call them about that industry. Because there's an easy opportunity to do it now. And are some of those folks classically trained journalists? In many cases, not. But I mean, there too, I think the core tenets of journalism are things that a lot of folks can grasp if we give them any opportunity to do so. So when I say it'll be better in the future, it's a composite of all these things. Both the fact that we have more participation from various sources, that we have the easy opportunity for folks to publish, not that that guarantees you an audience, and that we have a lot of technological tools that allows us to address the stories in different ways, is why I think it'll be richer and better. The fact that we simply we'll have many, many more sources to choose from.
Let me do a time check. How are we doing on time?
2 minutes till 7.
Okay. So we'll take a couple more questions. I actually want to follow up on the question that the student from Denmark asked. A lot of, you're talking about content and blogs. Much of that is provided for free. When we're talking to journalism students or young people trying to break into the business or stay in the business, what would your answer be to the people who are populating or who are creating content, but really they're not getting paid for it?
Well, I mean, two things there. I mean, I don't have the absolute numbers here, so this is a little bit speculative. As I said, overall now, my sense is we have a richer content ecosystem. It's not all hard news, obviously. There's a lot of soft stuff out there. But when one looks at, if you look at the newspaper industry, then clearly you're going to see data that says that the number of full-time journalists employed by newspapers over the last decade has gone down, right? But if you look at the larger ecosystem and all of the content sites that are out there, whether it's that parenting site or the gadget site or the many variations thereof, in sum total, I think there's a rich set of opportunities there, without question. Now, to the point about the role of, in a sense, voluntary participation in the ecosystem. I mean, one thing I do think that is true is that what we're, because, and obviously people are doing this stuff because they want to do it, first of all. It might be a part-time effort on their part, it might be a hobby on their part, whatever, they do it. I do think, in a sense, what we're seeing with content production is similar to what we've seen in music, which there's a very, very long tail of participation in the music industry. I think there's a very, very long and increasingly long tail of participation in the content industry as well. There are more people producing content ever before in the history of time. Right? You could say, well, a lot of it is chaff, and no question, a lot of it is chaff, but my sense is the wheat to chaff ratios probably stay about the same. So when you look at that, when I say that, you look at the long tail of participation in the music business and it doesn't relate to content. Well, if you look at the music business, yeah, there are, I mean, I'm always amazed. I can't seem to bump into the same band twice if I'm, you almost have to be determined to do that today. Are all of them making vast sums of money? Of course not. There are a tiny amount that make vast sums of money, and there are another amount that do okay, and it kind of tails off for things. So you get a lot of folks doing things out of passion, and I think we're seeing that in the content space. So I'm not suggesting that your careers are based in doing things for free. No, if you want journalism to be your profession, then clearly you're going to be looking to do things where you're getting paid for what you do. I'm just saying, in thinking about that, so broaden your scope of opportunity beyond, quotes, the traditional news organizations.
Did you still have a question?
Yes, actually, I'm Aisha Rizvi. I'm also a journalism student at the school. On my perspective, journalism is a little bit different when I am labeled as a journalist. I like to think that people think that I'm unbiased and truthful in whatever I am writing about or telling them about. So your point about masking personal beliefs in terms of political affiliations, I just wanted to ask, wouldn't that sort of create biasness in journalism articles if people know?
I think what creates biases is people feel that somehow your reporting is being, is being skewed by that, right? It's like it's hard for me to get away with the notion that providing less information about you is helpful to me in deciding whether or not you're being truthful or not. I mean, the truth is, it's not so much about what your political affiliation is the proof is in your work. Right? But look, the truth is that the damage doing to trust in journalism is more by the pretend journalists like Andrew Breitbart. And I frankly got rather pissed the last several days over this sort of meme that he was this like courageous journalist provocateur. Guy had no sense of appropriate ethic.
One more, or maybe two more questions, and I know you had your hand up, so we'll go.
My name is Tom Prida. I run a small news organization, a micro news organization called the Ocean Beach Bulletin. And I have two very closely related questions, and one will sound antagonistic. That question is, how does one reach a live person at Google to get a real human understandable answer for how Google News operates and how one can make one's efforts as a journalist match with the things that Google does in order to do this kind of surfacing of good work that we've been talking about. And that's the antagonistic part. But one of the reasons that I'm asking this is my organization is, when Google notices us, we're classified as a blog when we surface in news results. I don't think of it as a blog. It's not run like a blog. The fact that it's online in a website is really only a tiny portion of what we do. We started as a Twitter-only news publication for a while, which is kind of weird, but it evolved. So how does one get a person or somebody that can sort of help you understand what's going on at Google? And then how does Google distinguish between what is a just plain news result, and what is it that makes that blog notation show up when a certain website is surfaced in results?
Okay. First of all, I would encourage you to take a look at our inclusion guidelines, which are quite different. We changed them recently, about 3 or 4 months ago. You know, we do get a little bit cryptic in our communications, and one of the reasons we get cryptic is there are so many folks out there who are trying to game us. We spend more time getting bad, spammy sites out of the system than we can bear. So we do get kind of cryptic. But do take a look at the inclusion guidelines. They have changed, and in some fairly significant ways. We don't look at blogs differently from other sites.
Why is that notation there?
It shouldn't be now. If there's a notation in there that says, we may, whether someone categorizes himself as a blog is one thing, whether we treat that in our ranking is another.
Okay, was that just day before yesterday we showed up with the little parenthetical that said blog?
Yeah, and that's a different story, but that doesn't affect our ranking, or your ranking, I should say. We've completely changed those distinctions. What we're looking for is quality content on you know, from any. You know, and also it's hard for us to make judgments about who a news source is. I don't want to be in the position of deciding who's a news organization and who's not. So our bias is always towards inclusion, and then when we see people do bad things, we kick them out. As far as the human contact perspective, that's a little tricky given what I said. We have tens of thousands of sites around the globe. That being said, I believe there are support connections there. And now that you've seen me, you know how to get a hold of me. We do have human beings. They will actually get on the phone with folks if it's necessary.
Okay.
But we don't make that too obvious simply because we just don't have the resources to support it, honestly. I mean, you know, and I don't, Google saying they don't have resources or complaining about that, it sounds kind of ludicrous. But the truth is, you know, yeah, we have certain limitations. I have a support team that's probably about 10 people. And they have, you know, lots and lots of people who are looking for their time, but we'll do what we can to help, I can assure you.
What I think
Make sure to get my card.
What I think we're going to do is, because I want to respect everyone's time, and I want to thank you first for coming here, making time to hear, I think, what is really an educational moment for us, and in education and in the industry. If you do have questions, I'm hoping that you can stay around for a couple of minutes. We have some wine. And some cheese. Some people have been snacking already. If you could mix and mingle, and that way you could perhaps ask your questions one-on-one. And Rochelle reminds me, she's my colleague, we are seeking donations in journalism. So, Rochelle, do you have a few words to say about this?
Well, has anyone heard that there's a budget crisis going on in the state? We are the victims of it. We need all the help that we can get. Thank you very much. Take 2. So, if you enjoyed this free talk, we would love it if you shared your appreciation with us. So I'm going to pass a few of these out. Thank you very much.
And again, you know, I'm not saying everything I said is the answer. You know, if anything, I just would like to sort of challenge folks' thinking and get folks to think in different ways. And if that's achieved, then great. And whether people disagree with me or find that I'm wrong, that's fine too. Just get the thought process running about how we move things in a slightly different direction, or an aggressively different direction.
All right. Thank you so much, Richard.